Evelina screamed as another wave of pain tore through her body, and in that same moment, the door of the birthing room burst open. A courier stood there, out of breath, holding a sealed envelope stamped with the crest of House Ashworth. The midwife, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Fenwick, shouted at him to leave, but he refused. He said his orders came directly from the Duke, and the letter had to be delivered now, without delay. Evelina reached out with a shaking hand, sweat pouring down her face, and took the envelope even as another contraction gripped her. She tore it open between breaths. Her eyes moved across the words, and her whole body went cold despite the fire of labor burning through her. It was a divorce notice, signed by her husband, Duke Cassian Ashworth. Not a letter of concern, not a letter asking about her condition, or the child she was about to bring into the world. Just cold, formal words ending their marriage, as if she were a business arrangement he no longer needed. Mrs. Fenwick tried to take the paper from her hands, begging her to focus on breathing, on pushing, on the baby who was moments away from arriving. But Evelina could not let go of it. She clutched the paper even as her son's first cry filled the room, even as the midwife cut the cord and wrapped the baby in a soft blanket. She held her newborn son in one arm and the divorce paper in the other, and for a long moment, she said nothing at all. The women in the room exchanged nervous glances. Nobody understood why the Duke, who had always seemed so devoted, would choose this exact moment to send such news. Some whispered that he must have found someone else. Others said perhaps he had discovered a secret about Evelina that made him turn away. None of them knew the truth, and neither did Evelina, not yet. She looked down at her son's small face, red and wrinkled and perfect, and something inside her shifted. The sorrow was still there, sharp as a blade, but underneath it, something harder was forming. She would not let this moment break her. She would not let her son grow up thinking he was unwanted or unworthy of a name. When the household priest arrived the next morning to record the birth, Evelina was ready. She sat up in bed, pale but composed, her son sleeping peacefully beside her. The priest asked for the name she wished to give the child. The room went silent. Everyone expected her to choose a name from her own family, to distance the boy from a father who had abandoned them both. Instead, Evelina said clearly and without hesitation, Cassian Ashworth II. The priest paused, his pen hovering over the parchment, unsure if he had heard correctly. She repeated it, her voice steady. If the Duke wanted to erase her from his life, she would make certain he could never erase himself from his own son. Every time he heard the name, every time anyone spoke of the boy, he would be reminded of what he had walked away from. The servants in the house began to talk. Some admired her courage, calling it the sharpest kind of quiet defiance. Others feared it would only bring trouble, that a woman scorned by a duke should keep her head low rather than draw more attention to herself. But Evelina did not care what they thought. She had spent months preparing for a future with her husband, decorating a nursery, choosing fabrics for the baby's clothes, and now all of that had collapsed into a single sheet of paper, delivered at the cruelest possible moment. She thought back to the months before, when Cassian had left for what he called urgent business. He had kissed her forehead and promised to return before the baby arrived. He had seemed anxious in those final days, distracted, often disappearing into his study for hours with the door locked. She had assumed it was nerves about becoming a father. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely, some hidden truth he had never shared with her. Days passed, and no word came from the Duke himself. No apology, no explanation, nothing beyond the cold legal document that had arrived through a stranger's hands. Evelina's maid, a kind young woman named Agnes, tried to comfort her, bringing warm broth and fresh linens, sitting with her through the long nights when the baby cried, and Evelina's own tears refused to stop. "You do not have to stay here," Agnes said one evening, as she rocked the baby gently. "You could go somewhere new, somewhere nobody knows your name or your sorrow." Evelina considered this for a long time. The estate, once a place of warmth and promise, now felt like a cage, lined with memories she could not escape. Every hallway reminded her of walks she had taken with Cassian. Every room held some trace of the life they had planned together. She did not want her son to grow up surrounded by ghosts of a marriage that had ended before he even opened his eyes. But leaving meant giving up everything she had known. It meant walking away from the protection of a great house, from the servants who had cared for her, from the only home she had known since her marriage. It meant facing the world alone with a newborn child and very little money of her own, since most of her allowance had come directly from her husband. Still, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that staying might be worse. If the Duke had truly decided to end their marriage, there was no reason to remain in a house that no longer wanted her. Pride, she realized, could be a kind of strength, even when it came wrapped in heartbreak. That night, as she nursed her son by candlelight, she made her decision. She would leave the estate before anyone official arrived to formalize the separation, before lawyers and courts turned her heartbreak into a public spectacle. She would take her son somewhere quiet, somewhere she could raise him with dignity, away from whispers and pitying glances. She spent the following days quietly gathering what she could. She sold a few pieces of jewelry through a trusted merchant in town, careful not to draw attention to herself. She packed only what was necessary: clothes for herself and the baby, a small amount of coin, and a single portrait of her own mother, who had passed away years before. Everything else, the fine gowns, the jewels gifted by the Duke, the elaborate furniture, she left behind. She wanted nothing that would remind her of the life she was leaving. Agnes begged to come with her, but Evelina refused, knowing that the girl had a family of her own nearby, and a future that did not need to be tied to scandal. Instead, she thanked her for her kindness, and promised, though she was not certain she could keep the promise, that she would find a way to send word once she was settled somewhere safe. On the morning she left, the sky was heavy with clouds, as if the weather itself understood the weight of what was happening. She wrapped her son close against her chest, pulled a plain cloak around her shoulders, and walked out through the servants' entrance, rather than the grand front doors she had once walked through as a bride. She did not look back at the house that had been her home. She did not allow herself to cry. A hired carriage waited at the edge of the property, arranged quietly through a contact Agnes had trusted. The driver did not ask questions, only nodded when she gave the name of a distant town, one where nobody would recognize the Duchess of Ashworth or her newborn son. As the carriage rolled away from the estate, Evelina held her baby tightly and whispered a promise to him, so soft that only he could hear it. She promised that no matter what happened, no matter how hard the road ahead might be, she would make sure he grew up knowing he was loved, knowing he belonged to a name that was rightfully his, regardless of whether his father ever came looking for them. She promised herself, too, in that quiet moment, that she would never again let anyone make her feel small or unworthy, not after everything she had survived to bring her son safely into the world. The carriage rattled along the country road as the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly against the roof. Evelina looked out at the passing fields, at the estate growing smaller behind her, and felt something strange settle over her chest. It was not quite peace, and it was not quite grief. It was something new, something she did not yet have a name for, a feeling that came from stepping into a future entirely her own, with a son who carried her husband's name, but who would grow up shaped only by her love and her strength. She did not know, as the carriage carried her further from everything familiar, that the man she believed had abandoned her was, at that very moment, riding hard through the night toward the estate, unaware that the woman he loved and the child he had never met were already gone. She did not know that the letter she had received had never truly come from him at all, and that somewhere behind the walls of his own house, a plot far darker than simple heartbreak had been carefully set into motion. For now, she knew only one truth. She was a mother. She had a son, named after the man who had seemingly cast her aside. And she would carry that name forward, with a strength she had never known she possessed, into a future neither of them could yet imagine. The rain grew heavier as the carriage pressed on, and Evelina closed her eyes, holding her son close, letting the rhythm of the wheels carry her toward whatever waited next. Duke Cassian Ashworth arrived at his own estate just before dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his cloak soaked through from riding without rest for 2 full days. He had traveled from the northern border, where he had spent the last several weeks on a mission so sensitive that he had been forbidden to send even a single letter explaining his absence. The crown had needed him to investigate a plot against the royal treasury, one that touched several noble houses, and secrecy had been the only way to catch those responsible without warning them first. He had imagined this homecoming 100 times during the long ride south. He pictured Evelina waiting for him, perhaps with their newborn child already in her arms, perhaps still waiting for the birth. He had pictured apologizing for his silence, explaining everything once he was finally free to speak. What he found instead was a house eerily quiet, servants avoiding his eyes, and his study door standing slightly ajar when he was certain he had locked it before leaving. He called out for Evelina the moment he stepped through the entrance hall, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. No one answered. A young stable hand finally approached him, wringing his cap nervously in his hands, and told him that the Duchess had left several days earlier, taking the newborn son with her. Cassian felt the floor tilt beneath him. He asked why, and the boy hesitated before admitting that everyone believed the Duke himself had sent divorce papers to her during her labor. Cassian's blood went cold. He had sent no such letter. He had written nothing to Evelina since departing weeks earlier, precisely because he had been warned that any communication might be intercepted and used against the investigation. Someone else had used his name, his seal, his authority, to deliver a message that had shattered his wife in the very moment she needed comfort most. He stormed into his study, tearing through drawers and cabinets, searching for any sign of who might have accessed his personal seal. It did not take long to notice that the wax stamp, usually kept in a locked drawer, sat slightly out of place on his desk, as though someone had returned it in haste. Only a handful of people had access to that room. His mind immediately went to his cousin, Lord Rowan, who had been managing certain estate matters during his absence. Rowan had always resented Cassian's position. As a younger cousin from a lesser branch of the family, he had grown up watching Cassian inherit titles, land, and respect that Rowan believed should have been shared more evenly between them. Their grandfather had favored Cassian's father, and that old imbalance had never fully healed, even generations later. Rowan had masked his bitterness well over the years, playing the loyal cousin, the helpful advisor, the trusted friend, but Cassian had always sensed something guarded behind Rowan's easy smiles. He summoned the household steward immediately and demanded to know who had been present in the manor during the days surrounding the birth. The steward, an older man named Mr. Whitlock, who had served the family for decades, confirmed that Lord Rowan had visited the estate twice that week, each time requesting private access to the study, under the excuse of reviewing financial ledgers. Cassian's suspicion hardened into certainty. He rode immediately to Rowan's smaller estate on the eastern edge of the county, arriving just as the sun broke fully over the hills. Rowan answered the door himself, feigning surprise at his cousin's sudden and disheveled appearance. Cassian did not waste time with pleasantries. He demanded to know whether Rowan had forged the divorce papers sent to Evelina. Rowan's composure slipped only for a moment before he regained it, insisting he had no idea what Cassian was talking about. He claimed he had simply been assisting with estate matters as requested, nothing more. But Cassian noticed the flicker of unease in his cousin's eyes, the way his hands tightened slightly at his sides. Years of reading men across negotiation tables had taught Cassian to recognize a lie, even when it was wrapped in calm words. He did not have proof yet, not enough to accuse Rowan publicly, without risking a scandal that could damage the family name and complicate the ongoing investigation for the crown. But he understood now, with cold clarity, that someone close to him had deliberately tried to destroy his marriage while he was away serving his country. And whoever it was, had succeeded in driving away the two people he loved most in the world. He returned to his estate and immediately began organizing a search. He questioned every servant who had been present during Evelina's final days there, piecing together fragments of her final hours in the house. He learned she had sold jewelry through a merchant in town, that she had hired a carriage quietly, and that she had left without telling anyone her destination, not even Agnes, the maid who had cared for her so faithfully. Agnes, when Cassian finally spoke with her directly, was hesitant and clearly protective of her former mistress. She admitted only that Evelina had wanted to disappear completely, to raise her son somewhere far from judgment and gossip. She refused to share any further details, fearing that revealing too much might expose Evelina to further harm, especially if the person behind the forged letter was still somewhere near the estate. Cassian did not blame her for her caution. In fact, he respected it deeply, even as it made his search harder. He assured Agnes that he intended no harm toward Evelina, that he only wished to correct a terrible misunderstanding and bring his wife and son home where they belonged. Slowly, Agnes began to soften, though she still withheld the exact name of the town Evelina had mentioned before leaving. Meanwhile, word of the Duke's sudden return and his frantic questioning around the estate began to spread through the county. Whispers grew louder, some sympathetic to his situation, others eager to speculate about scandal within one of the region's most respected families. Cassian understood that time was against him. The longer Evelina remained missing, the more room there was for rumors to spiral out of control, and the more danger there might be if whoever had orchestrated this scheme decided to take further action against her. He hired discreet investigators, men skilled in quiet inquiry, who could search nearby towns without drawing unwanted attention. He sent letters to trusted contacts in the capital and surrounding regions, describing a woman traveling alone with a newborn son, careful to avoid revealing her true identity in case the letters fell into the wrong hands. Every night, he sat alone in his study, staring at the space where the forged seal had been misused, replaying every possible scenario of where Evelina might have gone. He thought of her strength, the fierce determination he had always admired in her, since the day they first met at a gathering hosted by mutual friends. She was not the kind of woman who crumbled easily under pressure. If she believed herself betrayed and abandoned, she would not wait passively for rescue. She would act, protect herself, protect their child, and disappear as completely as she needed to in order to feel safe. That thought brought him both comfort and fear. Comfort, because he knew she was capable of surviving on her own, of building a life even under the harshest circumstances. Fear, because the more capable she was of disappearing, the harder it would be to ever find her again, especially if she had no reason to believe he was searching for her at all. As days turned into weeks, Cassian grew more determined rather than less. He began to suspect that Rowan's motives went beyond simple jealousy or family rivalry. There were whispers among trusted allies that Rowan had accumulated significant debts through poor investments and secret ventures. Debts that could be resolved quickly if he found a way to claim a larger share of the family's holdings. If Evelina and her son remained missing, or, worse, if something happened to them, questions of inheritance and succession could shift dramatically in Rowan's favor. The realization chilled him. This was no longer simply about a broken heart or a misunderstanding that needed correcting. If his suspicions were correct, his wife and newborn son were not just lost, they were in genuine danger from a man willing to forge documents and manipulate an entire household to serve his own ambitions. Cassian doubled his efforts, calling in favors from allies across the region, expanding his search beyond nearby towns into the wider countryside, and eventually toward the edges of the capital itself. He knew Evelina was resourceful enough to seek anonymity in a crowded city, where a single woman with a child could blend into countless others without drawing attention. He also began quietly building a case against Rowan, gathering testimony from servants, examining financial records his cousin had access to, and consulting with a trusted friend in the capital who specialized in matters of law and inheritance disputes. He knew that when he finally confronted Rowan with undeniable proof, there would be no room for denial or escape. Late one evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows of his study, mirroring the storm that had carried Evelina away weeks earlier, Cassian received word from one of his investigators. A woman matching Evelina's description had been seen boarding a coach bound for the capital, traveling with an infant, and carrying herself with quiet dignity, despite clearly modest means. It was not certain, but it was the first real lead he had received since beginning his search. He allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, a small flicker of hope. Somewhere in that vast, crowded city, his wife and son were building a life without him, believing themselves abandoned. He intended to find them, to explain everything, and to make certain that whoever had tried to tear his family apart would answer for what they had done. But he also understood that finding them would only be the beginning. Convincing Evelina to trust him again, after everything she had endured, would be an entirely different battle altogether. The capital swallowed Evelina whole the moment her coach rolled through its crowded gates. She had never seen so many people in one place, merchants shouting over each other in the marketplaces, carriages weaving between pedestrians, the smell of bread and smoke and river water mixing in the busy air. It was overwhelming, but it was also exactly what she needed. Nobody here knew her face. Nobody here would whisper about the Duchess who had been cast aside during childbirth. She found modest lodgings above a bakery owned by a widow named Margaret Price, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Evelina faintly of her own late mother. Margaret asked few questions when Evelina introduced herself simply as Eve Carter, a young widow seeking quiet rooms for herself and her infant son. Margaret's only requirement was punctual rent and respectful behavior, both of which Evelina could easily provide. The small room above the bakery was nothing like the grand estate she had left behind, but it had a narrow bed, a modest hearth, and a window that let in soft morning light. It was enough. She spent her first nights there listening to her son's steady breathing, grateful simply for the safety of an ordinary, unremarkable life. Money, however, remained a constant worry. The coin she had gathered from selling her jewelry would not last forever, and she refused to rely on charity or risk drawing attention by reaching out to anyone connected to her old life. She began taking in needlework, mending garments for local shopkeepers, and eventually earning a small reputation for her fine, careful stitching. Margaret helped spread word among her customers, and slowly, Evelina built a modest but steady stream of work. She named her days around her son's needs, waking before dawn to nurse him, working through the mornings while he slept in a basket beside her small table, pausing whenever he stirred to comfort him. It was exhausting in ways she had never imagined, but there was also a strange satisfaction in it, a sense of purpose, built entirely from her own hands, rather than inherited privilege. She thought of Cassian less often than she expected to, though he still crept into her mind during quiet moments, especially when she watched their son's face shift into an expression that reminded her sharply of his father. She wondered sometimes if he ever thought of them, if he had moved on entirely, perhaps already remarried, or preparing to. She forced those thoughts away whenever they surfaced, telling herself that dwelling on a life that no longer existed would only weaken her resolve to build a new one. Months passed in this quiet rhythm. Little Cassian grew steadily, his cries turning into babbles, his tiny fists learning to grip her fingers with surprising strength. Margaret doted on him whenever she had a spare moment, calling him her favorite customer, even though he had never purchased so much as a single loaf of bread. The bakery's regular visitors grew fond of seeing the quiet young widow and her cheerful baby, and slowly, without fully realizing it, Evelina began to feel something resembling stability. It was during one of her trips to the market, purchasing fabric for a commissioned repair, that she first met Josephine Whitmore. Josephine was a noblewoman, though she carried herself with none of the stiff formality Evelina remembered from her own circles. She had stopped to admire a particularly fine piece of embroidery Evelina was carrying, complimenting the delicate stitchwork with genuine enthusiasm rather than polite obligation. They fell into easy conversation, and Josephine, delighted to find someone with genuine skill and an eye for detail, asked if Evelina might be available to repair several gowns damaged during a recent journey. Evelina agreed, grateful for the opportunity, though she remained cautious, careful not to reveal too much about her past. Josephine, for her part, seemed entirely unconcerned with prying into her new acquaintance's history, simply grateful for skilled work and pleasant company. Over the following weeks, Josephine became a regular presence in Evelina's small world, often stopping by the bakery under the excuse of collecting mended garments, but staying far longer than necessary, chatting over tea, and admiring baby Cassian's growing personality. Evelina found herself relaxing slightly in Josephine's company, allowing herself brief moments of laughter and connection she had not experienced since leaving the estate. She did not know that Josephine's brother, Edmund Whitmore, was a close and trusted friend of Duke Cassian Ashworth, someone who had been quietly assisting in the search for the missing Duchess without any awareness that his own sister had already crossed paths with her. Fate, it seemed, was drawing threads together in ways neither woman yet understood. Meanwhile, in the capital's more affluent circles, whispers about the Duke's missing wife had begun to circulate more widely. Nobles loved little more than a good scandal, and the tale of a duchess vanishing with her newborn son during a supposed divorce had become fashionable gossip at dinner parties and social gatherings. Evelina heard fragments of these rumors occasionally, carried into the bakery by customers discussing the latest society drama, though she never allowed herself to react visibly, keeping her expression carefully neutral even as her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. She began to realize, with growing unease, that hiding indefinitely might not be as simple as she had hoped. The capital, while vast, was still connected through countless threads of gossip and social circles that occasionally brushed against even the most humble corners of the city. She started taking greater care whenever she left the bakery, avoiding busy market days when nobility might pass through, keeping her son's face covered when strangers lingered too long near their small table. One afternoon, while delivering a finished garment to Josephine's townhouse, Evelina caught a glimpse of a portrait hanging in the hallway, a formal family painting depicting several members of the Whitmore family alongside close friends. Among them, unmistakably, stood a man whose face bore a striking resemblance to descriptions she had heard whispered about the missing Duke's closest ally. Her stomach tightened with sudden unease, though she said nothing, quickly excusing herself before her reaction could draw attention. That night, she lay awake long after her son had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling of her small room, turning over the growing sense that the walls of her carefully constructed anonymity were beginning to close in. She loved Josephine's company, valued the small friendship that had bloomed unexpectedly in her isolated new life, but she could not ignore the danger of being pulled, however innocently, back into circles connected to the very family she had fled. She considered, briefly, cutting ties with Josephine entirely, disappearing once again into a quieter, more distant corner of the city, where no threads could possibly connect back to her old life. But the thought of losing the only genuine friendship she had built since leaving the estate filled her with a reluctance she had not expected. Josephine had never once asked prying questions, had never treated her with anything but warmth and respect, entirely unaware of who she truly was. Evelina told herself she would simply be more careful, more guarded, keeping enough distance to protect her secret, while still allowing herself the small comfort of friendship in an otherwise lonely existence. She did not yet know how quickly circumstances would test that fragile balance, or how soon the careful walls she had built around her new identity would begin to crack under the weight of her son's own undeniable resemblance to the father he had never met. For now, she focused on the simple joys available to her, the sound of her son's laughter as Margaret bounced him gently on her knee, the satisfaction of a well-finished piece of embroidery, the quiet comfort of Josephine's easy company over shared tea. She allowed herself, cautiously, to believe that perhaps she had truly found a way to build a life entirely her own, far from the pain and betrayal that had marked her son's first breath in the world. But even as she settled into this fragile peace, forces she could not see were already beginning to move around her, drawing the threads of her hidden life steadily closer to the truth she had worked so hard to leave behind. Lord Rowan paced the length of his private study, his boots striking hard against the wooden floor with every turn. Weeks had passed since Cassian's return, and though no direct accusation had been made against him, Rowan could feel the noose tightening with each passing day. Servants who once greeted him warmly now seemed hesitant in his presence. Letters he sent to trusted contacts within the estate went answered with careful, guarded replies, rather than the easy cooperation he had once enjoyed. He had expected the forged divorce papers to accomplish two goals cleanly. First, to drive Evelina away in shame and heartbreak, removing her and any potential heir from the picture entirely. Second, to cast enough doubt and confusion over the situation that Cassian, upon his return, would find himself tangled in scandal and grief, rather than clear-headed enough to notice the manipulation behind it. Instead, his cousin had returned sharper and more determined than Rowan had anticipated, immediately suspecting foul play, rather than accepting the situation at face value. Rowan poured himself a drink, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the glass. His debts had grown far beyond what polite conversation or careful management could resolve. Poor investments in a shipping venture that had failed spectacularly, combined with substantial losses at private card tables, among circles he should have known better than to trust, had left him owing sums that threatened not just his reputation, but his very freedom should certain creditors decide to press formal claims. His only path forward, as he saw it, involved securing a larger claim to the family's holdings, a claim that became significantly more complicated the moment Evelina's son was born healthy and named directly after his father. If the child had never existed, or if the marriage had ended cleanly through Cassian's own choice, Rowan's position as next in line for certain properties and titles would have strengthened considerably. Instead, he now faced a legitimate heir, whose very existence threatened everything he had hoped to gain. He had believed, foolishly perhaps, that once Evelina vanished with the child, enough time and distance would eventually work in his favor. Perhaps she would never be found. Perhaps Cassian, humiliated and heartbroken, would eventually accept the situation and move forward with a new marriage entirely, one Rowan could influence more directly. But watching his cousin's relentless, methodical search unfold over the following weeks, Rowan realized his plan had badly underestimated the strength of the bond between Cassian and his missing wife. He decided he needed to take more direct action, rather than simply waiting for circumstances to resolve themselves. Through a network of unsavory contacts he had cultivated over the years, contacts who specialized in finding people who preferred not to be found, Rowan began his own quiet search for Evelina, hoping to locate her before Cassian's more official efforts succeeded. If he could find her first, he reasoned, he might still find a way to ensure she remained hidden, or perhaps convince her through less than honest means that returning to the estate would only bring further harm to herself and her son. His contacts moved through the capital's less reputable corners, questioning coach drivers, innkeepers, and merchants who might have crossed paths with a woman traveling alone with an infant. Progress was slow, frustratingly so, as the capital's sheer size made tracking a single individual among its thousands of residents an enormous challenge, even for experienced investigators. Meanwhile, Cassian's own search, though conducted through more legitimate channels, began to close in more quickly than Rowan had anticipated. Cassian's investigator, a sharp former soldier named Nathaniel Pierce, had confirmed sightings of a woman matching Evelina's description near several bakeries and marketplaces in the eastern district of the capital, though her exact residence remained elusive. Cassian himself had begun spending more time in the capital directly, staying at a modest townhouse owned by his trusted friend Edmund Whitmore, rather than drawing attention through a more prominent residence. Edmund, unaware that his own sister Josephine had already befriended the very woman Cassian sought, offered his full support in the search, introducing Cassian to contacts throughout the city who might prove useful. One evening, over a quiet dinner at Edmund's townhouse, Cassian confided the full weight of his suspicions regarding Rowan's involvement in the forged documents. Edmund listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled as Cassian laid out the timeline of events, the misplaced seal, the servant's testimony regarding Rowan's private access to the study during the critical days surrounding the birth. "If your suspicions are correct," Edmund said slowly, setting down his glass, "then this goes far beyond simple family rivalry. This is a calculated attempt to seize control of your inheritance, and possibly to harm your wife and child in the process." Cassian nodded grimly, having reached the same conclusion himself weeks earlier. "I need proof, Edmund. Enough proof that no court, no council of peers, could dismiss it as mere speculation or personal grudge. Rowan is careful. He will not have left obvious evidence behind." Edmund offered to help gather testimony from contacts within the capital's financial circles, individuals who might have knowledge of Rowan's mounting debts and the increasingly desperate measures he had taken to address them. Between Cassian's own investigators and Edmund's social connections, the two men began slowly assembling a case that painted an increasingly damning picture of Rowan's motives and actions. As their investigation progressed, Josephine occasionally joined her brother's dinners, and it was during one such gathering that she mentioned, almost in passing, a talented young seamstress she had recently befriended, a widow named Eve Carter, who lived above a bakery in the Eastern District and cared for an infant son alone. She spoke fondly of the woman's skill and quiet dignity, entirely unaware of the significance her casual mention carried for the two men listening intently across the table. Cassian felt his heart nearly stop at the mention of the Eastern District, the same area where Nathaniel Pierce had reported possible sightings of Evelina. He asked Josephine carefully, trying to keep his voice steady, whether she might describe the woman further, or perhaps arrange an introduction under some innocent pretense. Josephine, delighted at the interest, agreed readily, unaware that she was potentially reuniting a family torn apart by deception, rather than simply making a pleasant social introduction. She promised to invite her seamstress friend to a small gathering the following week, giving Cassian just enough time to prepare himself for what might finally be the breakthrough he had been desperately searching for. Rowan, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of this fortunate turn of events within Cassian's search. His own network of contacts continued their slower, less connected investigation through the capital's rougher corners, following false leads and outdated information that led nowhere productive. The gap between the two searches, once wide, had suddenly narrowed dramatically, thanks to nothing more than a chance social connection neither side had anticipated. As Cassian prepared for the gathering Josephine promised to arrange, he found himself torn between overwhelming hope and cautious fear. After months of searching, the possibility of finally seeing Evelina again, of meeting the son he had never held, felt almost too significant to fully comprehend. He worried about how she might react upon seeing him, whether the pain and betrayal she had endured might have hardened her heart beyond any hope of reconciliation. He also understood that revealing himself too soon, without first securing solid proof against Rowan, could place Evelina and their son in greater danger, rather than resolving the situation cleanly. If Rowan discovered that Evelina had been found before Cassian's case against him was fully prepared, there was no telling what desperate measures his increasingly cornered cousin might attempt. He decided, after much deliberation, that he would attend Josephine's gathering, not as the Duke seeking his missing wife, but simply as a guest, observing quietly at first, ensuring the situation was safe, before revealing his true intentions. He needed to protect Evelina and their son above all else, even if that meant delaying the reunion he desperately craved for just a little while longer, until he could guarantee their safety beyond any doubt. The days leading up to the gathering passed with agonizing slowness for Cassian, each hour stretching endlessly as he balanced his growing excitement with the careful, methodical planning necessary to protect his family from the danger still lurking in the shadows of his own household. Evelina almost declined Josephine's invitation to the small gathering. The thought of stepping into any setting connected to nobility, even a modest evening among friends, filled her with unease she could not fully explain. But Josephine had insisted so warmly, promising it would be nothing more than a quiet dinner among a handful of close acquaintances, that Evelina eventually relented, telling herself that a few hours of pleasant company would do her good, after months of isolation and careful hiding. She left her son in Margaret's capable care for the evening, the older woman insisting she deserved a night away from constant responsibility, and dressed in her finest remaining gown, a simple but well-made dress she had kept from her old life, stripped of any obvious markings that might reveal her former status. She styled her hair plainly, wanting to appear as ordinary as possible among Josephine's more prominent circle. The Whitmore townhouse glowed warmly with candlelight as she arrived, and Josephine greeted her with genuine affection, immediately introducing her to a small group of guests gathered in the sitting room. Evelina smiled politely, careful to keep her responses brief and vague whenever conversation turned toward questions of her past or family background, a skill she had grown practiced at over the preceding months. She did not notice, at first, the tall figure standing near the far window, half turned away, as he spoke quietly, with Edmund Whitmore. It was only when Josephine called out cheerfully, inviting the man to join their small circle and meet her talented seamstress friend, that Evelina turned fully toward him, and her entire world seemed to stop. Cassian stood frozen as well, his glass nearly slipping from his fingers, as he recognized her instantly, despite the simple gown and the months that had changed her slightly, thinner perhaps, with new lines of exhaustion around her eyes that had not been there before. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the room around them fading into irrelevant background noise. Josephine, sensing the strange tension but misunderstanding its cause, laughed lightly and remarked that perhaps they had met before, given how surprised they both appeared. Evelina forced herself to breathe, to steady her racing heart, aware that any dramatic reaction would draw unwanted attention and questions she was not prepared to answer in front of strangers. "It has been some time," Cassian said carefully, his voice low, meant only for her ears despite the crowded room around them. Evelina's jaw tightened, old anger and hurt rising sharply to the surface, even as relief and confusion tangled together within her chest. She excused herself quickly, claiming a sudden headache, and Josephine, though disappointed, did not press the matter, simply offering to have a carriage arranged for her friend's return home. Cassian, however, followed her out into the hallway before she could leave, his voice urgent but careful, aware of how easily this moment could shatter if handled wrongly. "Evelina, please, just a few minutes. I did not send that letter. I swear to you, on everything I hold dear, I did not send it." She turned to face him fully then, her eyes bright with unshed tears and years of accumulated pain. "You expect me to believe that after everything? After I labored alone, after I raised our son alone for months, believing you had abandoned us both without so much as a single word of explanation." Cassian stepped closer, though he kept respectful distance, understanding instinctively that pushing too hard now could destroy any chance of rebuilding trust. He explained quickly, quietly, the details of his secret mission for the crown, the strict orders forbidding any communication during that period, his shock and horror upon returning home to discover what had happened in his absence. He told her about the misplaced seal, about Rowan's suspicious presence in the study during those critical days, about the mounting evidence suggesting his own cousin had orchestrated the entire cruel deception in a desperate bid to secure inheritance and resolve crushing debts. Evelina listened, her expression shifting slowly from guarded anger toward cautious, painful consideration. "Why should I believe this rather than simply believing you changed your mind and later regretted it?" she asked, though her voice had softened slightly, betraying the war raging within her between hope and self-protective doubt. Cassian reached into his coat and produced a folded letter, one he had carried with him for weeks, specifically for this moment, should he ever find her. It was an official confirmation from a trusted contact within the royal court, verifying his assignment during the exact period in question, proof that he had genuinely been unable to communicate with anyone during those critical weeks. Evelina took the letter with trembling hands, reading it carefully in the dim hallway light. She recognized the official seal, understood enough of court procedures from her time as Duchess to know such documentation could not easily be forged or fabricated. Slowly, painfully, the walls she had built around her heart began to crack. "Our son," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "He is well. He is healthy and strong." Cassian's composure broke slightly at the mention of his child, his eyes filling with emotion he had held carefully in check throughout their entire conversation. "May I see him? Please, Evelina. Whatever happens between us, whatever time it takes for you to trust me again, please let me at least see my son." She hesitated for a long moment, torn between protective instinct and the undeniable truth that this man, whatever his failures, deserved the chance to know his own child. Finally she nodded, though her expression remained guarded, unwilling to promise anything beyond this single concession. They arranged for Cassian to visit the following afternoon at Margaret's bakery, in careful, controlled circumstances that would allow Evelina to maintain some sense of safety and boundaries. Cassian agreed immediately, grateful beyond words for even this small opening after months of desperate searching. Before she left that evening, Evelina paused and turned back toward him one final time. "This does not mean I forgive you, Cassian. It does not mean I am ready to return to that life, to that house, to everything that happened there. It means only that I am willing to hear more, for our son's sake if nothing else." Cassian nodded solemnly, understanding fully the weight of what she offered and the vast distance still remaining between reconciliation and the current fragile truce. He watched her carriage disappear into the night, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and renewed determination. He knew now, more urgently than ever, that he needed to finalize his case against Rowan quickly, both to protect Evelina and their son from any further danger, and to clear his own name fully of the cruel deception that had torn his family apart. Time, he realized, had suddenly become far more critical than before, now that he knew exactly where his wife and son could be found. That same danger, unfortunately, worked both ways. If Rowan's own search efforts happened to stumble upon the same information Cassian had just gained, through careless conversation or unfortunate coincidence, the consequences could prove disastrous. Cassian resolved to move quickly, quietly and carefully, protecting his newfound connection to his family, while simultaneously closing the net around the man who had tried so hard to destroy it. He returned to Edmund's townhouse that night, with a renewed sense of urgency, immediately requesting that his investigators intensify their efforts to gather concrete proof against Rowan, understanding now more than ever that every day of delay carried real risk for the people he loved most. Cassian arrived at the bakery the following afternoon, dressed plainly, having left behind any obvious markers of his title, in favor of a simple coat that would not draw attention on the busy street. His hands trembled slightly as he climbed the narrow staircase Margaret pointed him toward, his heart pounding with an anticipation unlike anything he had experienced even during his most dangerous assignments for the crown. Evelina opened the door before he could knock, having watched for his arrival from the window. She stepped aside to let him enter, her expression carefully neutral, though he noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the protective way she positioned herself near the small basket where their son slept peacefully, unaware of the significance of this moment. Cassian approached slowly, almost reverently, kneeling beside the basket to look upon his son for the first time. The baby stirred slightly, opening his eyes briefly before settling back into sleep, and Cassian felt tears he could not hold back slipping down his face, at the sight of the small face that so clearly carried traces of his own features. "He has your eyes," Evelina said quietly, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the small room. Cassian looked up at her, his expression raw with emotion he made no effort to hide. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick. "Thank you for keeping him safe, for everything you have done alone these past months." They spent the following hour speaking carefully, cautiously, rebuilding fragments of trust, one small conversation at a time. Cassian shared more details about his ongoing investigation into Rowan's activities, the mounting evidence his investigators had gathered regarding his cousin's substantial debts and increasingly desperate financial dealings. Evelina listened intently, her own anger toward Rowan growing as she began to understand the full scope of the deception that had shaped the last several months of her life. "What happens now?" she asked finally, watching as their son began to stir in his basket, his small fists waving in the air as he slowly woke. Cassian considered his answer carefully. "I need to gather enough proof to bring formal charges against Rowan before the family council. Until then, I worry that revealing your location too widely could place you and our son at further risk, especially if Rowan realizes his scheme has begun unraveling." Evelina nodded slowly, understanding the careful balance they now needed to maintain. She agreed to continue living quietly above the bakery for the time being, maintaining her disguise as the widow Eve Carter, while Cassian worked to finalize his case. They agreed he would visit regularly, though carefully, always taking precautions to avoid drawing unwanted attention that might lead Rowan's own investigators back to her hidden location. Over the following weeks, a fragile but genuine routine developed between them. Cassian visited several times, always in the afternoon when the bakery's regular customers had thinned, and privacy could be more easily maintained. He held his son for the first time during one such visit, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he cradled the small child against his chest, whispering promises Evelina could not quite hear, but recognized instantly as heartfelt. Slowly, cautiously, something resembling warmth began to rebuild between them, though Evelina remained careful not to move too quickly, mindful of the deep wounds that still needed time to heal fully. She watched Cassian interact with their son, noted the genuine tenderness in his actions, and allowed herself small moments of hope, even as she guarded against fully trusting that this reconciliation would hold once the immediate danger from Rowan had passed. Meanwhile, Cassian's investigation continued gathering momentum. Nathaniel Pierce had successfully tracked down a merchant who confirmed selling certain rare inks and papers to Rowan's household, materials that matched precisely those used in the forged divorce documents. Edmund Whitmore, through his own extensive social connections, had gathered testimony from several individuals within the capital's financial circles, confirming the staggering scope of Rowan's accumulated debts, along with desperate attempts to secure additional loans against future inheritance he did not yet legally possess. Piece by piece, the case against Rowan grew stronger, more difficult to dismiss as mere family rivalry or baseless accusation. Cassian began preparing formal documentation to present before the family council, a group of respected elder relatives who held authority over serious disputes within the extended Ashworth family, matters too delicate or significant to be handled through ordinary courts alone. He knew that once he formally presented his case, Rowan would have little room left to maneuver, facing potential exile from the family entirely, loss of whatever remaining status and connections had allowed him to operate so freely, and possibly criminal charges, depending on the full extent of his financial deceptions, beyond simply the forged documents. But Cassian also understood the danger inherent in cornering a desperate man. Rowan had already proven willing to manipulate an entire household, to forge official documents, to shatter a marriage, through cruel deception, timed at the most vulnerable possible moment. There was no telling what further desperate measures he might attempt, once he realized his careful scheme was truly unraveling, beyond any hope of recovery. Cassian increased security discreetly around Evelina's hidden location, arranging for trusted associates to keep quiet watch over the bakery and surrounding streets, without drawing attention to themselves or revealing the true purpose of their presence. He wanted to ensure that if Rowan's own search efforts happened to stumble too close to the truth, there would be sufficient warning and protection in place before any real danger could materialize. Josephine, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of the full situation unfolding around her friendship with Evelina, though she noticed subtle changes in her seamstress friend's demeanor, a certain guarded watchfulness that had not been present before. She attributed it, kindly, to the natural stress of raising a child alone, never suspecting the true drama unfolding just beneath the surface of their pleasant friendship. One afternoon, as Evelina delivered a finished garment to the Whitmore townhouse, she overheard fragments of conversation between Josephine and a visiting acquaintance, discussing recent rumors circulating through noble circles regarding strange financial troubles within a prominent family. Troubles apparently connected to reckless investments and mounting gambling debts. Though no names were mentioned directly, Evelina's stomach tightened with sudden unease, recognizing the description matched precisely what Cassian had shared with her regarding Rowan's situation. She mentioned this to Cassian during his next visit, and his expression grew grim as he confirmed that such rumors had indeed begun circulating more widely, a development that could prove dangerous, depending on how quickly they reached Rowan himself. If Rowan realized that suspicion was mounting publicly, rather than remaining contained within Cassian's private investigation, he might act more rashly, more desperately, in ways far harder to predict or control. "We need to move quickly now," Cassian said, his voice tight with renewed urgency. "I will present my case to the family council within the week, before Rowan has time to prepare a defense, or, worse, attempt something reckless in a final desperate bid to protect himself." Evelina nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation, despite her continued uncertainty regarding her own future with Cassian personally. Whatever remained unresolved between them as husband and wife, she recognized clearly that their son's safety, and quite possibly her own, depended entirely on Cassian succeeding swiftly and decisively in exposing his cousin's treachery before Rowan could cause further harm. That night, after Cassian departed, Evelina sat quietly beside her sleeping son, watching his peaceful face in the dim candlelight, praying silently that the coming days would bring resolution rather than further danger, that the fragile peace they had built together, both as a family and as two people slowly rebuilding trust after devastating betrayal, would not shatter once again before it had truly even begun to heal. The market square buzzed with its usual midday activity when Evelina made her way through the crowded stalls, her son balanced comfortably on her hip as she searched for fresh vegetables to supplement the modest meals she prepared each evening. He had grown considerably over the past months, no longer the fragile newborn who had first entered the world amid such heartbreak, but a curious, alert child, beginning to reach for objects and babble sounds that almost resembled words. She paused at a stall selling ribbons and small trinkets, allowing her son to reach out and grasp at a colorful bit of fabric that caught his attention. An older woman standing nearby, examining similar wares, glanced over casually, before her expression shifted suddenly into something sharper, more focused. She stared at the child's face for a long moment, then looked up at Evelina, with unmistakable recognition dawning in her eyes. "Forgive me," the woman said slowly, "but that child looks remarkably like young Lord Cassian Ashworth. I served in the Ashworth household years ago, before my retirement. The resemblance is extraordinary." Evelina's heart lurched painfully, and she forced a polite smile, quickly explaining that many children shared similar features by pure coincidence, that her son's name simply happened to be common enough within the region. The woman nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she remained unconvinced, and Evelina hurried away from the stall as quickly as she could, without appearing overly suspicious. She returned to the bakery shaken, her hands trembling slightly, as she settled her son into his basket, her mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. If a single former servant could recognize the resemblance so quickly, how many others might notice similarly as her son continued growing, his features becoming ever more clearly defined and increasingly reminiscent of his father's distinctive appearance. She shared the encounter with Cassian during his next visit, watching his expression grow troubled as she described the woman's sharp recognition and lingering suspicion. He agreed immediately that this represented a serious escalation in the risks they faced, one that could no longer be managed through simple caution alone. "We cannot continue relying on anonymity indefinitely," he said gravely. "Our son grows more like me each day, and eventually, someone connected to Rowan, or simply someone with sharp enough memory, will make the same connection, regardless of how carefully we try to conceal your identity." Evelina agreed reluctantly, understanding the truth of his words, even as the thought of abandoning her carefully built anonymity filled her with fresh anxiety. She had grown accustomed to her quiet life above the bakery, to Margaret's kind companionship, to Josephine's easy friendship, none of which she wished to lose entirely, regardless of the growing danger. Cassian proposed a solution that offered some measure of increased safety without requiring an immediate, dramatic return to the estate that Evelina still felt unprepared to face. He suggested relocating her and their son to a more private, secure residence within the capital, one owned quietly by a trusted associate, where controlled access and careful discretion could better protect them from chance encounters like the one at the market. Evelina considered this carefully, ultimately agreeing that increased security outweighed her reluctance to disrupt the fragile stability she had built. They arranged the move discreetly over the following days, with Margaret understanding fully the necessity, despite her sadness at losing such cherished tenants, and Josephine informed only that her friend had received unexpected assistance from distant family members, allowing her to secure more comfortable accommodations. The new residence, a modest but well-secured townhouse in a quieter district, offered considerably more protection than the bustling area surrounding the bakery. Cassian arranged for trusted staff, individuals whose loyalty he had verified thoroughly, to assist with the household while maintaining strict discretion regarding the true identity of its occupants. Despite these precautions, the incident at the market had clearly signaled a turning point, one that made the urgency of resolving the situation with Rowan feel even more critical than before. Cassian pressed forward with finalizing his case, working long hours alongside Nathaniel Pierce and Edmund Whitmore to ensure every piece of evidence was properly documented and verified before presenting the matter formally to the family council. Unfortunately, the market encounter had consequences beyond simply alerting Evelina and Cassian to increased risk. The former servant, genuinely curious and unable to shake her suspicion regarding the striking resemblance she had witnessed, mentioned the encounter to several acquaintances over the following days, describing the young widow and her remarkably familiar-looking child in casual conversation that gradually spread further than she likely intended. Word eventually reached one of Rowan's own contacts, a man employed specifically to monitor exactly this kind of gossip circulating through the capital's less prominent social circles. Recognizing the potential significance immediately, the contact reported the information directly to Rowan, describing the location where the woman had reportedly been seen and the striking family resemblance that had prompted the former servant's curiosity. Rowan received this news with a mixture of relief and renewed determination. After months of frustratingly slow progress through his own limited network, this unexpected lead offered exactly the opportunity he desperately needed. He immediately dispatched additional resources to investigate further, hoping to locate Evelina's exact residence before Cassian's own search could reach any formal conclusion that might expose his carefully constructed deception. Fortunately, by the time Rowan's contacts arrived to investigate the bakery more thoroughly, Evelina and her son had already relocated to their new, more secure residence, leaving no clear trail connecting their previous location to their current whereabouts. Margaret, loyal and protective of the young widow who had become dear to her, revealed nothing useful when questioned by unfamiliar strangers, asking vague questions about her former tenant, simply stating that the woman had moved on, without providing further details regarding her destination. This near miss, though ultimately unsuccessful for Rowan's purposes, served as a stark warning to Cassian regarding how close his cousin's search efforts had come to succeeding. He redoubled his own efforts, understanding clearly now that time had become an even more critical factor than he had previously realized. Rowan was actively searching, drawing steadily closer through whatever resources and contacts remained available to him, and any further delay in exposing his treachery could result in catastrophic consequences for the family Cassian was desperately trying to protect and reunite. He finalized the last remaining pieces of his case within days, confident that the evidence gathered painted an undeniable picture of Rowan's forgery, his access to the private study during the critical period surrounding the birth, and the financial desperation that had motivated such a calculated, cruel deception. He requested an emergency session of the family council, citing matters of urgent importance regarding inheritance disputes and serious allegations against a family member. The council, respected elders who took such requests seriously, given Cassian's own standing and reputation for careful, measured judgment, agreed to convene within days, understanding from his urgent tone that whatever matter he wished to present carried significant weight and consequence. Cassian prepared himself thoroughly, organizing every piece of testimony, every document, every verified account into a clear, methodical presentation, that would leave no room for doubt or dismissal. As the day of the council meeting approached, tension mounted steadily on both sides. Rowan, sensing perhaps through subtle changes in how relatives and associates treated him that suspicion was closing in more rapidly than he had anticipated, grew increasingly desperate and erratic in his own actions, pushing his remaining contacts harder to locate Evelina before matters escalated beyond his control. Cassian, meanwhile, focused every remaining resource on ensuring Evelina and their son remained completely secure until the council could formally address the situation, understanding that once Rowan's scheme was fully exposed, the greatest danger might paradoxically emerge from his cousin's final, desperate attempts to salvage something from the wreckage of his failed ambitions. Rowan's contacts finally traced the widow and her child to a quiet townhouse in the capital's northern district, information that reached him only hours before Cassian's scheduled presentation before the family council. Panic surged through him as he realized how little time remained. If Cassian succeeded in exposing his forgery and financial desperation before the council, any hope of salvaging his position within the family would vanish entirely, replaced potentially by criminal prosecution and complete social ruin. He made a decision born entirely of desperation rather than careful planning, gathering 2 men from his network of unsavory contacts and setting out immediately toward the address his informants had provided. His plan remained hazy, even to himself, driven more by frantic need to control the situation somehow than any clear strategy for how doing so might actually resolve his mounting crisis. He arrived at the townhouse as afternoon shadows lengthened across the quiet street, positioning his men to watch the entrance while he approached alone, hoping perhaps to convince Evelina through manipulation or threat that her safety and her son's safety depended entirely on disappearing again, this time permanently and without any further contact with Cassian whatsoever. Evelina, alerted by one of the household staff Cassian had arranged to watch over her, noticed the unfamiliar man loitering near the entrance and immediately recognized the danger, having been warned extensively by Cassian regarding exactly this kind of threat. She gathered her son quickly, moving toward a secondary exit the staff had shown her specifically for such emergencies, while simultaneously sending word through a young messenger boy toward Edmund Whitmore's townhouse, where Cassian remained finalizing preparations for the council meeting scheduled for the following morning. Rowan, growing increasingly frustrated when his knock at the front door went unanswered despite clear signs of occupancy, eventually forced his way inside, only to find the residence hastily abandoned, a half-finished cup of tea still warm on the table, a child's small toy left behind in the rush to escape. Fury and desperation combined within him as he realized his target had slipped away yet again, this time through what could only have been a warning, delivered just moments before his arrival. He stormed back outside, questioning his men sharply about anyone they might have seen leaving the property. One of them mentioned a young boy running quickly down the street shortly before Rowan's own approach, information that immediately suggested someone had indeed warned Evelina of the impending danger. Rowan realized, with mounting alarm, that his cousin's protective measures around the widow extended further than he had anticipated, meaning Cassian likely already suspected exactly the kind of desperate action Rowan had just attempted. Meanwhile, Evelina hurried through unfamiliar streets, her son held tightly against her chest, following directions the household staff had provided toward a secondary safe location Cassian had arranged specifically for emergency situations. Her heart pounded with fear, not just for herself, but overwhelmingly for her son's safety, understanding now with terrifying clarity exactly how dangerous Rowan had become as his careful schemes unraveled around him. She reached the designated safe house, a modest but secure residence owned by one of Cassian's trusted military associates from his years of service to the crown, and was welcomed immediately by the associate's wife, a calm and capable woman named Beatrice, who had clearly been briefed thoroughly regarding the possibility of exactly this kind of emergency arrival. Within the hour, Cassian himself arrived, having received the urgent message from the messenger boy, and rushed immediately from Edmund's townhouse, despite the late hour and his own exhaustion from days of intensive preparation for the council meeting. He found Evelina shaken but composed, their son thankfully unharmed, and already settling into unfamiliar surroundings with the resilient adaptability children often possess. He came to the house, Evelina said, her voice tight with residual fear, even as relief at Cassian's arrival washed visibly over her features. Your staff warned me just in time. Cassian, he is truly desperate now. There is no telling what he might attempt next. Cassian held her briefly, an embrace born entirely of shared fear and relief, rather than any romantic reconciliation. Though even that brief contact carried weight neither of them fully acknowledged in the tense moment. He assured her that additional security would be arranged immediately, that the council meeting scheduled for the following morning would finally, decisively end the danger Rowan represented, provided nothing further went wrong, before proceedings could formally conclude. That night proved long and tense for everyone involved. Cassian remained at the safe house, unwilling to leave Evelina and their son unprotected, given how close Rowan had come to locating them, while Nathaniel Pierce and several trusted associates maintained careful watch throughout the surrounding streets, alert for any sign that Rowan's men might attempt to track the family to this new location as well. Rowan, meanwhile, retreated to his own estate in a state of mounting panic, understanding that his reckless attempt to intercept Evelina directly had likely only accelerated his own downfall, rather than providing any genuine solution to his mounting crisis. He considered fleeing the region entirely, abandoning everything rather than facing the council's judgment, but recognized that doing so would only confirm his guilt beyond any possible denial, while also leaving him with no resources or protection wherever he might attempt to rebuild his life. Instead, in a final, desperate gambit, he decided he would attend the council meeting himself, hoping perhaps to discredit Cassian's evidence through sheer bold denial, or failing that, to offer some manner of confession that might secure leniency, rather than the full weight of consequence his actions truly deserved. He spent the remaining hours before dawn drinking heavily, rehearsing explanations and justifications that grew increasingly hollow even to his own ears as the night wore on. Morning arrived with a heavy gray sky that seemed to match the tension gripping everyone involved in the unfolding drama. Cassian departed the safe house early, leaving trusted guards behind to protect Evelina and their son, and made his way toward the Grand Hall, where the family council traditionally convened for matters of serious importance. He carried with him every piece of evidence gathered over the preceding weeks, organized meticulously to present an undeniable case against his cousin's treachery. Evelina, unable to simply wait passively while the confrontation she knew would determine so much of her family's future unfolded elsewhere, found herself pacing the safe house restlessly throughout the morning, her son's presence the only thing keeping her grounded through the anxious hours. Beatrice tried to distract her with quiet conversation and small tasks, but Evelina's mind remained fixed entirely on the outcome of the meeting she could not attend directly. She knew that whatever happened within that grand hall would finally determine not just Rowan's fate, but her own future as well. Whether she and Cassian might genuinely find their way back toward the family they had once hoped to build together, or whether the damage inflicted by months of separation and betrayal had simply grown too deep for any reconciliation to fully heal. The morning stretched onward with agonizing slowness, as she waited for word of how the confrontation would ultimately unfold. The grand hall fell silent as Cassian entered, carrying a leather case containing every piece of carefully gathered evidence against his cousin. The family council, 5 respected elders whose combined judgment held significant authority over matters affecting the extended Ashworth family, sat solemnly at the head of the room, their expressions grave as they recognized the seriousness reflected in Cassian's formal request for this emergency session. Rowan arrived shortly after, his usually composed appearance noticeably strained, dark circles beneath his eyes betraying the sleepless night he had endured. He took his seat across the hall from Cassian, forcing a confidence into his posture that did not quite match the nervous energy evident in his tightly clenched hands. The eldest council member, a stern woman named Lady Winifred who had known both cousins since their childhood, called the session to order and invited Cassian to present the matter he had requested this urgent gathering to address. Cassian rose, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, and began methodically laying out the sequence of events that had unfolded over recent months. He described returning from his sanctioned assignment for the crown to discover his wife had fled the estate, believing herself divorced through a forged document sent during her labor. He presented testimony from household staff confirming Rowan's private access to his study during the exact period the forgery must have occurred, along with the merchant's confirmation regarding matching inks and papers purchased specifically by Rowan's household. He continued, presenting documentation of Rowan's substantial and mounting debts, Testimony from financial contacts within the capital, confirming increasingly desperate attempts to secure loans against inheritance he did not yet legally hold. And finally, the account of Rowan's attempted intrusion at the townhouse, where Evelina and their son had been staying, an act witnessed by household staff, who had helped facilitate her safe escape just moments before his arrival. The council listened in heavy silence, occasionally exchanging troubled glances as the weight of evidence accumulated steadily against Rowan. When Cassian finished his presentation, Lady Winifred turned her sharp gaze toward Rowan, inviting him to respond to the serious allegations laid before the council. Rowan rose slowly, his earlier bravado crumbling visibly beneath the combined weight of evidence and the stern expressions of council members he had known his entire life. He attempted initially to deny the accusations, claiming the timing of his study visits had been entirely coincidental, that his financial troubles, while real, bore no connection whatsoever to the forged documents in question. But his voice lacked conviction, and the council members, experienced in discerning truth from desperate fabrication, after decades of handling family disputes, saw clearly through his weakening denials. Lady Winifred pressed him further, asking directly whether he could explain his presence outside the townhouse the previous evening, an incident already confirmed through multiple witnesses, including Cassian's own household staff. Rowan's composure finally shattered entirely under the weight of direct questioning. He sank back into his seat, his shoulders slumping as the last of his defiance drained away, replaced by something closer to exhausted resignation. In halting, broken sentences, he began confessing the truth, admitting to forging the divorce documents using Cassian's stolen seal, admitting his desperate hope that removing Evelina and the newborn heir would strengthen his own claim to family holdings, sufficient to resolve his crushing debts. He admitted, too, to his desperate attempt at the townhouse the previous evening, though he insisted, perhaps truthfully, that he had intended only to frighten Evelina into permanent hiding, rather than to cause any direct physical harm to her or the child. Whether this distinction mattered significantly to the council's judgment remained uncertain, given the clear pattern of calculated deception and increasingly reckless desperation his actions had demonstrated. The council deliberated briefly before delivering their judgment. Rowan would be formally stripped of his remaining title and any claim to family inheritance, effective immediately. He would be required to make full financial restitution for damages caused, though given his existing debts, this would likely consume whatever remaining assets he possessed. Furthermore, given the severity of his forgery and the genuine danger his actions had posed to Evelina and the infant heir, the council recommended formal legal prosecution be pursued, beyond simply the family's internal judgment. Rowan received this verdict with quiet, defeated acceptance, offering no further protest as guards summoned by the council escorted him from the hall to await formal legal proceedings. The weight of months of desperate scheming, financial ruin, and increasingly reckless action had finally collapsed entirely under the accumulated evidence Cassian had so carefully gathered. Cassian felt no particular satisfaction watching his cousin led away, only a heavy, complicated relief that the danger threatening his family had finally been resolved through legitimate means, rather than further violence or desperate confrontation. He thanked the council members formally for their swift and fair judgment before hurrying from the hall, eager to return to Evelina and share the news that the threat hanging over them for so many months had finally been fully extinguished. He rode quickly toward the safe house, where Evelina and their son remained waiting, his heart lighter than it had felt in months, despite the emotional exhaustion of the morning's proceedings. As he approached, he found himself considering not just the relief of Rowan's defeat, but the far more delicate question of what remained now between himself and Evelina, whether the trust shattered by months of separation and fear could genuinely be rebuilt now that the external danger threatening them had finally passed. He understood clearly that legal resolution against Rowan, however necessary and satisfying, represented only one piece of the larger reconciliation still required. Evelina had endured months of believing herself abandoned, had built an entirely new life through her own strength and resourcefulness, and deserved far more than simple assumption that danger's end automatically meant restoration of their marriage exactly as it had existed before. He arrived at the safe house to find Evelina waiting anxiously at the window, having watched the street since dawn for any sign of his return. The moment she saw his expression, relief, and something like cautious hope flooding across her features, She understood immediately that the confrontation had concluded favorably, that whatever danger Rowan represented had finally been resolved. "It is over," Cassian said simply as he entered. "Rowan has confessed everything before the council. He has lost his title, his inheritance claims, and will face formal prosecution for what he has done. You and our son are finally, truly safe." Evelina felt the tension that had gripped her for months finally begin to release, though complicated emotions remained tangled within her chest, relief mixing uncertainly with lingering questions about what genuine safety and resolution truly meant now for her relationship with the man standing before her. Weeks passed, following Rowan's formal removal from the family. Weeks during which Evelina slowly allowed herself to breathe freely, for the first time since that terrible morning when the divorce papers had arrived during her labor. The constant fear that had shadowed every day since then finally lifted, replaced by a cautious, tentative peace she had almost forgotten was possible. She remained at the secure townhouse Cassian had arranged, though she no longer needed to fear discovery or pursuit, her true identity now openly acknowledged among the small circle of trusted staff and associates who had helped protect her throughout the ordeal. Josephine, once informed of the full truth by her brother Edmund, expressed only warm delight, rather than any sense of betrayal at having unknowingly befriended the missing Duchess, insisting their friendship meant just as much to her, regardless of the secrets Evelina had been forced to keep. Cassian visited regularly, careful never to presume more than Evelina offered willingly, allowing their relationship to rebuild slowly, through consistent, patient presence, rather than any expectation of immediate forgiveness or restored intimacy. He spent hours with their son, watching him grow more animated and curious each visit, learning the particular rhythms of fatherhood that circumstances had denied him during those first crucial months. One evening, as autumn light slanted golden through the townhouse windows, Cassian arrived carrying something he had kept carefully protected throughout the preceding months: the official court letter, confirming his assignment during Evelina's labor, alongside additional documentation from the Crown, formally acknowledging the service he had provided, and the sacrifice his forced silence had ultimately cost him personally. He found Evelina in the small garden behind the townhouse, watching their son attempt his first wobbling steps across the grass, her expression soft with the particular pride only a parent could fully understand. She looked up as he approached, and something in her gaze had shifted subtly over recent weeks, a softening that suggested perhaps the deepest wounds had finally begun their slow healing. "I brought something," Cassian said, settling beside her on the garden bench and offering the folded documents. "I know you have already seen the proof of my assignment, but I wanted you to have the official Crown acknowledgement as well, so there could never be any doubt remaining about what truly happened during those weeks." Evelina accepted the papers, reading them carefully, though she had already largely accepted the truth of his account weeks earlier. She folded them gently and set them aside, turning instead to look directly at him, her expression thoughtful and searching. "I have been thinking," she said slowly, "about what it means to truly rebuild something that was broken so completely. I do not think we can simply return to exactly what we had before, Cassian. Too much has happened. I have changed. I learned things about my own strength that I never knew existed within me." Cassian nodded, understanding fully the weight of her words. "I do not want to return to exactly what we had before either. I want something better, something built with full honesty and genuine partnership, rather than the assumptions we perhaps carried too easily before. I do not deserve automatic forgiveness simply because Rowan's guilt has been proven. I understand that trust must be rebuilt slowly, through actions rather than words alone." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching their son stumble happily across the grass, occasionally falling and immediately pulling himself back upright, with determined giggles that lightened the heavy conversation surrounding them. Evelina finally spoke again, her voice carrying genuine warmth rather than the guarded caution that had characterized so many of their previous conversations. "I am willing to try, Cassian. Not because everything is suddenly resolved, but because I believe you when you say you want something genuinely better, rather than simply a return to how things were. Our son deserves parents who choose each other honestly, who build a family through real partnership rather than obligation or convenience." Relief and profound gratitude flooded through Cassian at her words, though he remained careful not to overwhelm the delicate progress they had achieved with excessive emotion. He reached out, gently taking her hand, and she allowed the contact, her fingers curling slightly around his, in a gesture that felt like genuine hope, rather than mere tolerance. Over the following months, they began slowly rebuilding their marriage on entirely new foundations. Evelina eventually agreed to return to the estate, though she insisted on maintaining certain independence she had discovered during her months alone, continuing her needlework as a genuine skill rather than simple necessity, maintaining her friendship with Josephine and Margaret, regardless of her restored status as Duchess. Cassian, for his part, worked diligently to demonstrate through consistent action that he valued Evelina's strength and independence, rather than expecting her simply to resume her previous role, without acknowledgement of everything she had endured and overcome. He involved her more directly in estate matters, valued her perspective genuinely, rather than merely as ceremonial courtesy, and made certain their son grew up witnessing a partnership built on mutual respect, rather than rigid tradition alone. Young Cassian Ashworth II grew steadily, his childhood shaped by parents who had weathered genuine crisis and emerged with a relationship stronger and more honest than what had existed before their separation. He never knew the full details of the danger and deception surrounding his earliest months, though as he grew older, his parents shared the story carefully, wanting him to understand the strength his mother had shown, the resilience that had carried them through darkness toward genuine reconciliation. The name Evelina had chosen in defiance and heartbreak during her darkest moment ultimately became a symbol of something entirely different than she had originally intended. Not spite against an absent father, but eventually, genuine testament to a family rebuilt through honesty, patience, and mutual commitment to something better than mere survival of circumstance. Rowan, meanwhile, faced the full consequences of his actions through formal legal proceedings, stripped entirely of the status and connections he had once possessed, his desperate schemes ultimately costing him everything he had hoped to gain through deception and manipulation. His fate served as a quiet but permanent reminder within the extended family of the genuine consequences awaiting those who chose treachery over honest dealing, regardless of how carefully such schemes might initially be concealed. Years later, Evelina would sometimes look back on that terrible morning when the divorce papers arrived during her labor, recognizing it now not simply as the darkest moment of her life, but as the beginning of a journey that had ultimately revealed strength within herself she might never otherwise have discovered. The pain had been real, the betrayal genuine in its cruelty, but the family she and Cassian had ultimately built together, tested thoroughly by crisis and emerging stronger through honest reconciliation, stood as testament to the possibility of genuine healing even after the deepest wounds. Their son grew into his name proudly, understanding eventually the full weight of what his mother had endured to ensure he never felt unwanted or unworthy of his father's legacy, and the story of their family became, in time, not one of betrayal and heartbreak alone, but ultimately one of resilience, truth prevailing over deception, and love genuinely rebuilt through patience, honesty, and unwavering commitment to something real.